Well, welcome everyone. I'm Nate Bolin, a partner with K&L Gates, based here in Washington, D.C. Very excited to be having time with you today. And thank you again for AGMA and ABMA for sponsoring this webinar series. This one truly is a series in what I suspect will be a longer term series of check-ins on a number of issues that I know the membership of both associations care a lot about. We are going to spend the time ahead, the next hour or so, talking about what has happened since the election in terms of changes in U.S. trade policy, energy-related policy, other priorities within the administration, the incoming administration, and the new or soon-to-be new Congress, as well as what remains to be done in the current lame duck session. And we certainly welcome your questions. We'll try to take as many of those as we can get to today. So please feel free to put those in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we have time. I'm very excited to be joined by two of my colleagues here in Washington, D.C. Matt Leggett, who has a tremendous amount of experience, and you'll hear from him directly about that, his resume within the Congress, and as an attorney who specializes, among other things, in energy and infrastructure policies, as well as with Scott Gelbman, who also has tremendous experience within the U.S. Congress and more broadly in Washington, who is here to talk about a number of aspects of his job and the topics he's following currently that are relevant, I think, to all of you. So let me briefly turn it over to both of them to do some introductions. For my own part, I think most of you know me by now, but I am a partner here in Washington, D.C. I focus on international trade issues. I have worked on these issues for almost 21 years now. And this is in many ways a sense of a repeat of some of the themes and topics that we saw under the first Trump administration, with some key differences, all of which will be likely very impactful for most companies in both associations. So with that, let me turn it over to Matt, and Matt and Scott can do a little bit of an introduction. We'll then have both of them do some overviews on what the election results have been. I think everybody probably knows that at a fairly high level, but we'll get into and pull some strings on that. We'll talk about trade, we'll talk about energy, and then what to expect from the next Congress. So Matt, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Nate. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you all about sort of the energy policy outlook going forward. My name is Matt Leggett. I'm a partner with the Washington, D.C. office of K&L Gates. I joined the firm around 2 years ago now. I left the staff in the U.S. Congress after 17 years of service. Most recently, I was chief counsel of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Before that, I was chief counsel of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And before that, I was in Senate Republican leadership, sort of handling those committees from the energy, environment, natural resources perspective. So delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Hey, good to see everybody again. My name is Scott Gelbman. I'm a government affairs advisor here at the K&L Gates Washington, D.C. office. January will be 4 years I've been with the firm. And prior to joining K&L Gates, I worked for more than 6 years for Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, handling a number of issue areas, including energy, environment, and technology. And I also spent some time as a policy spokesperson for Ford Motor Company. So really looking forward to this presentation and to all of your guys' questions.
Great. Well, thanks so much, guys. We have a jam-packed session, so we'll just jump right into it. To recap, here's our agenda. We're going to talk about trade after a brief overview of the election. We're going to talk about energy and infrastructure, and then what to expect from the next Congress. Great. So, Scott, Matt, do you guys want to talk a little bit about what the election results are and what they mean?
Yep. Next slide. So I think, as everyone on this webinar knows, former President Trump won re-election for a second term, which will begin on January 20th, 2025. This time around, the election was decisive. President Trump won 312 electoral votes to 226 electoral votes. You can see the map of the country there, very red, with the exception of some spots on the coasts. And so that will mean a lot of change for Washington and DC and for federal policy, and certainly for the trade and energy spaces. Next slide. So this is just a little more information on, what some people are calling the red wave. President Trump and congressional Republicans will claim a mandate to enact, major change to the existing direction of Washington, D.C. Just some notes. President Trump improved versus 2020 in all 50 states, and the election will have consequential policy impacts. That will include the immediate reversal of many Biden-era policies, fast legislative push early next year, a different posture on executive, regulatory, and compliance actions. The DOGE, which I'm sure everyone has heard about, the Department of Government Efficiency. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, yet another swing in the political pendulum, which could swing back potentially depending on what happens over the next 2 years in 2026 midterms.
Let me just add really quickly, although it was a red wave, the margins were still incredibly close. With over 100 million votes, the election was really decided in around 250,000 votes in swing states. If those voters would have broke a different way, we would be talking about something that's completely different. And I know we'll talk about the congressional map more later on in the presentation, but House Democrats actually ended up taking a couple of additional seats, even though Republicans are still going to be in the majority.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it may tee up for a correction yet again in the 2026 midterms. Of course, that will largely be determined by how successful President Trump's agenda is over the next 2 years and how it's received by the American people. Next slide. So President Trump won on two primary issues, inflation and immigration, and trade negotiations. Nate will talk more about this, will revolve around tariffs, energy, and China. So with that, Nate, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Yeah, I think everybody has heard President Trump say on the campaign trail and otherwise that he views the word tariff as the most beautiful word in the dictionary. And I think everyone should take him very seriously at his word when he talks about potential tariff actions in the near future. So we're going to unpack what that might mean specifically, what the timing of that is going to be, and what the potential impact is on companies, including in the two industries of the associations, and what you all can be doing to prepare for that. Really, the first and key takeaway is that the president has an agenda that has focused around the impact and use of tariffs, that there's a lot of experience in the incoming team with the use of that as a tool. And there are a number of statutory authorities that give him the basis to take certain actions almost immediately upon taking office. In fact, we fully expect that there will be some trade actions as part of a raft of executive orders that the president will sign immediately after being sworn in as president on January 20th. If you want to have an unpacking of what exactly these actions might look like, first of all, I encourage you to take a look at the recent interview that the president-elect gave with NBC News. There's a little snippet, a screenshot of it there. Again, talking about the viewpoint on tariffs as being something that is a tool that will be used, and a viewpoint that there may be some costs to consumers and others within the United States, but a viewpoint also that the overall goals of the tariff policies are important and supersede some of the immediate and potentially somewhat minimized impact. There's a great deal of wealth of detail on the president's views, as well as the views of many of his key advisors in the book that is on the right-hand side of your screen. No Trade is Free. This was written by the U.S. Trade Representative under the first Trump administration, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. It goes into great detail about not only what happened in U.S. trade policy during that time, but the rationale and the workings of many of the policies that President Biden has continued, like the Section 301 tariffs on imports from China, and the overall philosophy of the administration coming into office in terms of the use of trade and tariff policy as a key tool of not only specifically on economic and trade issues, but a broader host of issues. So speed is going to be one of the key watchwords for the administration coming into office. They have experience of the first term, and there has been a tremendous amount of preparation already done before January 20th to be ready to take action almost immediately. And you see that reflected in things like the public messaging of the president-elect on things like threatening to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and an additional 10% tariff on China, other messaging about raising tariffs when countries at U.S. trade partners are not cooperating. Those are all things that should be taken seriously, in part because there is existing statutory authority to do all of the things that President Trump has talked about publicly. So the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, as well as the 10% on China, those can be done under the authority of a statute called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's the third box down on the screen in orange. And that is the statute that since the 1970s has provided authority for things like the U.S. sanctions on Iran or Cuba or Russia. And it also undergirds some of the recent actions taken by President Biden on a number of import and export related issues. One of the key features of that statute is it can be triggered and implemented upon a finding by the president that there is a national emergency in some regard. And that action can take place with no further notice and comment and without any further action. So it could take place and become effective immediately. And that's typically the pattern we see for some of the actions taken under this statute with regard to sanctions law, for example, and some of the other trade measures. So that could be done very quickly. And the president's allusion to immigration issues and illegal drugs being ones that threaten U.S. national security is a prelude to potentially using that statute as a trigger. We've seen since that initial threat that Mexico and Canada have made overtures to the incoming team and to President Trump, and he in turn has taken some steps backwards from that. But notably, we haven't seen the same message with regard to China. So I think there is a fairly good chance that we could see additional 10% tariffs on imports from China using this IEEPA mechanism. In addition, we have existing statutory authority to put in place tariffs on imports from China under the Section 301 mechanism. That is the basis for the 25% tariffs that are currently in place. And that is something that President Biden and his administration have kept in legal effect throughout the 4 years of his presidency, meaning that there is no need for additional fact-finding to raise additional tariffs on imports from China. That could be done on the basis of the existing factual record. And although there is some notice and comment that needs to be made in terms of what specifically is impacted by new tariffs, that can be done relatively quickly in Washington terms. So we're looking at potentially within the next 6 to 8 months, there could be additional tariffs in place on imports from China under that mechanism. There may also be further action on steel, aluminum, other products, automobiles, for example. And all this will be done in the context of a very hardball set of negotiations with China, issues involving the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, potential renewal of that, which is up for renewal in 2026, and a number of other trade irritants. If you take a look at the priorities of the incoming administration on the use of tariffs and trade policy, one of the key driving factors for that is a desire and a priority to eliminate what are viewed as persistent trade and goods deficits that the U.S. is running with some of its key trade partners. The list that you see here is a ranking in descending order of the countries with which we have the largest trade deficits when measured in terms of goods. If you read Lighthizer book, that's something that he emphasizes as a unsustainable practice for U.S. economy, for U.S. national security. The incoming administration shares those views, and so we can likely expect to see imports and trade issues with respect to the 15 countries that you see listed here be prioritized in the incoming administration. In some cases, the response will be potentially a threat of tariffs. In other cases, it may be done within the context of a renegotiation of a trade agreement or other pressures. But if you are importing from countries that are on this list, this is certainly an issue that you need to watch, and likely more so than other U.S. trading partners that don't run persistent trade deficits. Beyond just tariffs, we have a number of other issues that the administration is going to focus on, and critically among those is a holistic view and whole of government approach to addressing issues with regard to China. President Trump, his advisors coming in have described China as an existential threat to the United States, meaning that the Chinese Communist Party is something that threatens U.S. democracy, our way of life, our economic strength, and national security. And in response to that, we are likely to see a whole of government approach to push back on it, including tariffs, but also including things like export controls, potential sanctions on certain Chinese entities, more vigorous and expanded use of things like the anti-forced labor laws that we have put in place, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, for example, and a host of other issues designed to pressure China to come back to the negotiating table and potentially resolve some of these issues with a acceptance that if that can't be done, the U.S. is going to be willing to live with a greater separation of those two economies going forward. So in terms of export controls, sanctions, investment policies with regard to China, you can view essentially what was done under the Biden administration, which was quite significant in all those areas, as a floor upon which the new administration will be building, oftentimes notably with a fair amount of bipartisan support from the Congress and other stakeholders. So this is just a presentation of some of the issues I've already addressed in the slightly more flowchart type format. One thing that I haven't emphasized yet is that there is a tremendous amount of alignment among the incoming team within the Trump administration and on all of these issues. He, in his selection of nominees for key cabinet posts, as well as other advisors, has been very strategic and consistent in choosing people who have aligned views on issues like China, on tariffs and trade, on other ways, other tools to address things like U.S. trade deficits. And so, unlike in the first Trump administration, when there was some disagreement and diversity of views, on some of these issues, there's a greater amount of alignment. I'm not saying it's perfect and 100% unified block, but there is certainly, particularly with regard to China, a view that this is something that the U.S. needs to address and address quickly. So what could result from that? Well, the tariff actions I've mentioned. Scott and Matt will also talk about potential for future tax legislation. We may see a push to incentivize tax legislation that looks at favoring domestic manufacturing when it's sourcing inputs from within the United States and not favoring companies that are relying on imports. We can also expect to see some possible desire to use trade revenue, tariff revenue in offsetting some of the costs of tax cuts. And lastly, in this priority list is something that's been talked a lot about by Trump's incoming advisor team, an end to China's permanent normal trade relation status. That sounds very esoteric, but what that means is it would be withdrawing the most favored nation treatment that the United States has offered to China on a permanent basis since the year 2000, and potentially resetting the normal customs duties on imports from China upwards of 35, 45, 55%. And that's in addition to the 301 tariffs that are currently in place, and in addition to the 232 tariffs. It essentially would return China to the status that only a handful of countries have under the old Smoot-Hawley 1930s tariff rates. Potentially, that could be linked to a annual look at China's status and its cooperation or not with U.S. trade priorities, which was the case prior to the year 2000 when China had when there was an annual review and vote within the U.S. Congress to extend normal trade relations status temporarily to imports from China. All that would require legislation. All that is potentially going to be controversial, but it is something that, again, there is tremendous alignment on from the incoming team. So when you look at the heads of the President-elect's trade team, you have, again, people who have all made public statements affirming the summary of views that I just laid out. That includes the nominee for Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, who has a Wall Street background as well, but has described tariffs and trade policy as something there where the U.S. can have a gun on the table, an escalate to de-escalate approach to our relationships with other countries, and a tool that, as the president has said, can be used in many different contexts. Similarly, Treasury Secretary nominee Scott Bessent has also been public about those same views. The U.S. Trade Representative nominee, Jameson Greer, was the chief of staff under Ambassador Lighthizer in the prior administration and was on the forefront of a lot of the hard negotiating that the U.S. did with regard to NAFTA, China tariffs, and other issues. And then Peter Navarro, who was within the White House in the first Trump administration, is reprising that role as the director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. He is very much hawkish on China from a trade policy viewpoint and is, again, very aligned with the other folks you see here. Lastly, there is a clear alignment that extends outward from just the cabinet agencies that have responsibility for trade policy, and that includes the nominee for Secretary of State, Senator Marco Rubio, who has called for continued use of a basket of trade tools and other national security tools to address the existential threat, in his view, that China represents. Similarly, John Ratcliffe, nominated to be the head of the CIA, and the incoming National Security Advisor, Representative Mike Waltz, have expressed similar views. Notably, Mike Waltz, Peter Navarro are individuals who can be put in place on day one within the administration. There is not Senate confirmation required for those roles. And so we're likely to see a lot of these policies and decisions being run out of the White House, as well as the advanced teams that the administration is putting in place in the incoming months. You also have, on the sanctions front, there's going to be a return to this maximum pressure approach to certain partners or certain other countries in the world, including Iran, where the U.S. is going to be using every tool in its toolbox to address the actions of Iran in the Middle East and against Israel and other contexts, and that will include sanctions against countries that are continuing to trade with Iran, that the U.S. doesn't have direct jurisdiction over, but there will be a push to say to those companies and those countries that you need to choose. You can either continue to trade with Iran or you can trade with the United States, but we're not going to let you do both. And if you continue to trade with Iran, we're going to put you on a U.S. sanctions list and you'll be cut off from U.S. financial markets and any access to the United States. So if you are as part of a global group, or you're aware of certain companies that may still legally maintain operations in Iran, or certain other U.S. sanctioned countries, that is something that needs to be reevaluated, and likely quickly, because the U.S. is going to be doing some of these actions again, likely within the first 100 days of President Trump's second term. In terms of how to respond to all of this, well, one of the things that I think is very important to note is that the policy choices, although there's a unified school of thought, there's a unified approach to the incoming administration. These are also all individuals who tend to, throughout their careers, have been influenced by very much data-driven arguments in terms of what the impact of a particular policy choice may be on a company, and the U.S. workforce and U.S. investment. The takeaway from that is now is the time to be knowing your supply chain, knowing your investments in the United States, knowing who, where, and how many workers you have, and the investments that you've made, because those are all data points that can be very, very persuasive when you need to raise your hand and say, okay, we understand the direction of this trade policy, but here's the impact on our company. And just saying that generally without the data to back it up is not going to be as effective as having that data at your fingertips. It's also going to be important to actively engage with stakeholders, including Congress, state and local representatives, and political stakeholders, and of course, to be monitoring these developments. I think before this presentation, Matt, Scott, and I were talking about how many times we have updated our materials on these issues in the past 3 or 4 weeks alone. And I think that pace is only going to continue and perhaps accelerate in the coming weeks and months. So this is something where definitely monitoring and having a dedicated team looking at it is going to be critical. So with that, let me turn it back over to Scott and Matt to talk about energy, talk about some other issues within the U.S. Congress.
Thanks, Nate. And I agree with your assessment. If you think the information has been flowing fast and furious already, I have a feeling we're in for an entirely different cadence as we push to January 20th. So far, the Trump transition team has been focused on personnel and on sort of large strategic policy. But as they begin moving down the list of personnel and getting into more details on policy, I think we're going to see even more activity than we've already been seeing. And I have to confess, Washington, D.C. is, I don't think, quite used to this type of sort of New York cadence on a daily basis, especially during the holiday period. So it's been an interesting transition for Washington, I think, culturally as well. So I'm happy to provide an energy update now, and I'm just going to start with some very general remarks, and then give you guys some information on changes in personnel. So one thing is clear: the Trump administration is going to have a very different take on energy than the Biden administration has had. And I believe that will start on day one with the Trump administration sending its personnel into agencies to stop all work on existing Biden administration priorities, and to assess, what is being done, what has been done, and to determine whether or not to continue with, certain rulemakings, policies, enforcement actions, litigation in the courts, whatever the tool is that the executive branch is using, the Trump administration will review. In most cases, certainly in most significant cases, it's our expectation that the Trump administration will seriously consider stopping work permanently on those issues, and/or fully reversing those issues for that have been pursued by the Biden administration. We'll talk a little bit more about what's in the Trump administration's authority to do that later on in the conversation. So for purposes of energy, first of all, we will have a change in the committees of jurisdiction within both the House and the Senate. Keep in mind, it's not just President Trump that was elected, but the Republicans are taking the Senate, and they've also retained the House. And so at the top of each of the relevant committees for energy, you will have a Republican chairman, and on the Democrat side, you will have a Democrat ranking member. The chairman sets the agenda, sets the hearing schedule, determines what legislation is considered in committee. So lots of power. So in the House, we're going to have a new chairman, and we just found out this week it is Brett Guthrie from Kentucky. So he will be the chairman. Frank Pallone will continue to be on the Democrat side, the ranking member. Natural Resources, no change. Chairman Westerman, ranking member Grijalva. Oversight and Accountability, I don't know if we have an outcome there yet, but it's either Comer or Connolly. And they will be paired with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as ranking member. In the Senate, Senator Capito from West Virginia will be chairman. Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island will be ranking member. And that will be a change on the Democrat side. Senator Carper retired. He's the outgoing chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator Whitehouse will step in his place, leading the Democrats on that committee. Energy and Natural Resources Committee. My former employer, Senator Barrasso, has moved up to the number 2 position in Senate Republican leadership. He'll serve as Senate Republican whip. And as a result, he's no longer able to serve as chairman of a committee. So Senator Mike Lee from Utah will take that position alongside Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. At the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, Senator Ted Cruz will be chairman. Senator Maria Cantwell will be ranking member.
Can I hop in on that really
Yeah.
quickly? 2 quick points. Really important on the Senate side. Now the Republican new chairpersons will have subpoena authority, really being able to dig in on some of their investigative priorities, and energy is one of those as it relates to China. And in the House, you'll see there's sort of a youth and new face movement going on as it relates to some of the ranking members you see on oversight, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and there are some challengers to Mr. Grijalva, including Congresswoman Stansberry from New Mexico, as well as Jared Huffman from California. All to say, I think that folks are looking at the results of the election on the Democratic side, thinking through priorities, and potentially looking for some new faces. So I'd expect to see that going into January.
Yeah, great. Next slide. And so we'll just very quickly run through the announced cabinet nominees related to energy, environment, natural resources for President Trump. The first one is Interior Secretary and Energy Czar Doug Burgum. He's the governor of North Dakota, and has long been viewed as a top contender for many roles within a Trump administration. President Trump has announced his intent to nominate Governor Burgum as Interior Secretary. In addition, he's going to have Governor Burgum serve as the head of the National Energy Council at the White House. It will be interesting to see him juggle 2 roles, which I'm sure will be 2 major roles. He by all accounts is a very was a successful governor, and was a good manager, and should be able to get confirmed without much difficulty. Next slide. The next announced nominee is Chris Wright for DOE Secretary. Chris Wright is the founder and CEO and chairman of Liberty Energy, an oil field services firm. He's also director of the Domestic Energy Producers Alliance, which is a national coalition of oil and gas producers. Next slide. And the next slide is the EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. He represented New York's 1st congressional district in Congress from 2015 to 2023. He left office to run for New York governor in 2022 against New York Governor Kathy Hochul. He was, when he was in Congress, a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and he's generally seen as a pro-business New York Republican, moderate in many regards, but well respected, and will be believed to have good management capabilities. He does not have much of a profile in the environmental space itself. So within the EPA context, it will be interesting to see what Lee Zeldin prioritizes and how he manages what, in my opinion, is one of the most lightning rod roles in the federal government. So he has a big task ahead of him, especially not having a lot of experience in that specific space, but again, should be able to get confirmed pretty easily because he's widely viewed as competent and thoughtful and responsible, and certainly kind of business oriented. I would just say that these 3 cabinet nominees are currently the face of the evolving Trump administration's energy policy. And there's an old saying in Washington, which we are starting to see take effect, which is personnel is policy. And so as you watch President Trump nominate people as we watch sub-cabinet level people fill out the ranks, we will get an even clearer picture of where President Trump is going with his energy policy. Suffice it to say, it will be drill, baby, drill, in line with what President Trump has promised on the campaign trail consistently. Expect a very aggressive turn back to America's oil and gas resources, not only for domestic consumption, but also for export overseas. In addition to that, I should mention liquefied natural gas exports will I think again be approved on a consistent basis to support off-takers in Europe, in Japan, in other areas of the world where countries are trying to diversify away from coal, perhaps diversify supplies away from Russia, looking for lower carbon energy options. Liquefied natural gas will be, I think, a central piece of President Trump's foreign policy agenda and diplomatic power. In addition to that, on the tariff side or on the trade side, America's energy resources will almost certainly be brought to the table as one tool for addressing those trade deficits that Nate mentioned earlier. The conversation on energy within the Trump administration going forward will no longer be about climate change and addressing climate. Instead, I believe the narrative will be about artificial intelligence and producing enough energy within the United States to support our need as a country to win that race against China. And what is foundational to winning that race are the data centers that basically run the artificial intelligence and all of the energy that is needed to run those data centers. So I believe that we will see a turn back to very much an all of the above energy strategy that not only leverages oil, gas, but continues to incorporate renewables. This is nuclear power's opportunity to really resurrect itself and to build out new technologies like small modular reactors. We have seen many tech companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, others already enter into power purchase agreements and other types of agreements with small modular reactor companies in anticipation of using that energy resource for their data centers. So there is going to be a lot of activity in the energy space. The Trump administration, I believe, will deregulate to the extent it can, while also, paving the way for a very robust build out of American energy infrastructure across the board to satisfy AI and manufacturing, which the Trump administration is also committed to. Domestic manufacturing is also going to require a lot more energy. And so we're going to see energy growth, and with that, a lot of activity within the energy space. With that, I think we can move on to the next Congress. And within this segment, we can also talk a little bit more about some of the policies that may impact energy specifically.
Yeah, so the next Congress is going to be quite the interesting one. So as you see laid out on this slide, the Republicans maintain control of the House, albeit very, very slight, and they won a number of Senate races and now have a 3-seat majority going into next year. Due to one resignation and two folks being tapped from the House Republican caucus to serve in the Trump administration. When we start next year, the vote margin is actually going to be one vote. So 217 to 215 for at least 3 months while we await some special elections in a couple of districts in New York and Florida. In the House, a tie is a loss. So Speaker Johnson will actually he'll have to have his entire caucus in order to pass anything until April at the minimum. That is if every House Democrat is in attendance that day. That being said, there's going to be a lot of action we've already kind of heard in terms of budget reconciliation, and we can get a little bit more into that process later on in the presentation. I'll say this is a mid-level result. I think folks were a little bit surprised that House Democrats didn't end up taking the chamber. That being said, they did gain seats. And then in the Senate, even though Republicans do have a majority, there were a number of really close races in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin in Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, Ruben Gallego in Arizona. Those are places where Vice President Harris is credited for helping pull those really tight races over the finish line. And folks have been saying it looks like if a different candidate were to have been on the ballot, those may have gone the other way and given the Senate a way, way heavier tilt towards the Republican side. Next slide. A little bit more, and we'll go really quickly over the slide. This shows, President Trump is the first Republican president to win the popular vote in over 20 years. And it breaks down a little bit. He improved in almost every category as it relates to his support in 2020 versus 2024. Next slide. Republican leadership for next Congress. We have a new majority leader. Mr. McConnell is now taking over the defense appropriations gavel. And John Thune is going to be the majority leader next Congress. Matt already mentioned Mr. Barrasso being number 2, Cotton number 3, and then NRSC chair Mr. Scott from South Carolina. We still are expecting Speaker Johnson, Mr. Scalise, Mr. Emmer, and Mr. Hudson. That's all the same as last Congress. Next slide. In the Senate, we only had a switch for Democrats in number 3 and 4 positions. The new Policy and Communications Committee chair is Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. She is taking the place of Senator Stabenow, who's retiring, and then Senator Booker moved to the number 4 slot. And we are seeing the same exact, on the House side for Dems, the same exact makeup as this Congress. Next slide. Yeah.
And so facing full Republican control in Washington, Republicans will have a lot of tools at their disposal, and they'll have the maximum number of tools and the greatest opportunity because they will control the White House, the Senate, and the House. And as a result, they will work in a coordinated fashion to try to implement their agenda, starting on day one and striking quickly in the first and second quarter of next year. So I'll start just by going through really quickly the tools that the executive branch has, and then talk about what Congress has. So the executive branch, the president has the bully pulpit. That is an incredibly powerful tool for setting the agenda, for setting the sort of narrative and debate around the country. And clearly President Trump is very gifted at using that tool specifically. He's considered to be a real media innovator, and so we may even see some innovations with the use of the bully pulpit in terms of social media and other alternative ways of communicating that President Trump clearly gravitates towards historically. The second is nominations. We've already seen, and Nate and I have already talked a little bit about some examples of President Trump nominating certain people to implement his agenda that send clear signals to Washington and to those agencies about what his intentions are within those agencies in that subject matter area. President Trump on day one will likely issue any number of executive orders, perhaps to reverse or cancel executive orders from the Biden administration, perhaps to proactively, introduce new material into the discussion as directives to his agencies beyond the White House for different policies they should implement. Regulations will be pursued by agencies to implement those executive orders or just to implement statutes and laws already on the books, or that will be enacted later. Regulations are ultimately within the executive branch's authority, but depending on the process and through the typical process of the Administrative Procedures Act, regulations typically require notice and comment before making a final rule to give the public a seat at the table. Oftentimes regulations are also subject to lawsuits later on, and so there's litigation that often ensues. President also can, and secretaries can also issue guidance documents, policy statements, and they can implement their agenda through enforcement activities. On the congressional side, the Congress in the Senate provides advice and consent on nominations. So that is an opportunity for members of Congress to ask questions of nominees and to decide whether or not to support their nomination through a vote. And that nominations process is also an opportunity for our clients to engage very early on with trying to get the future administration and their nominees on the record about certain questions. Legislation is sort of self-evident. The Congress passes legislation, the president decides to sign it into law or veto it. Next year, we anticipate, with full control of Congress, the Republicans will pursue budget reconciliation, which is a process that allows them to enact legislation with only 51 votes in the Senate, as opposed to the normal 60 votes required under regular order. We also anticipate that Republicans will look back at previous Biden administration rules enacted within roughly June. We don't know what the actual date will be. Any rule enacted roughly June or July 2024 and forward will probably be will have the potential to be subject to a Congressional Review Act resolution, which the Congress can pass, again, with only 51 votes in the Senate, in order to repeal that rule and furthermore to block a substantially similar rule from being promulgated in the future. And so that tool will be used against, kind of midnight regulations is what they're called by the Biden administration. Of course, the Congress also can have hearings. It has oversight and investigation power. Scott mentioned, that Congress does have subpoena power, so can use that as well. Did you have any thoughts?
No, let's go to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah.
And want to make sure we might gloss over
Yeah.
the next couple of slides to make sure we have time to get to everybody's questions.
Yeah.
So policy changes, right? We mentioned the DOGE a little bit. That's still an effort that is very new, and everyone is a little unclear as to what exactly it means. What we're hearing is that obviously Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy will be running the effort. They are staffing up as we speak, and they will be really pushing forward in the first couple of months of 2025 to come out with some guidance for the president's budget that is released around March or April of every year, outlining the FY26 process and where they think we could have the most substantial cuts. We have tariffs and trade. Nate touched on that. We're going to continue to see tariffs coming out of the administration, and we're going to continue to see trade-related legislation coming out of the appropriate committees. What can ride on a budget reconciliation package remains to be seen, but these are issues that are going to continue to be touched upon next year. And then Tax-a-mageddon, or the tax Super Bowl. Using the budget reconciliation process, Republicans are already meeting to discuss how to reauthorize the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that President Trump implemented in 2017. That is going to be quite complex. It is going to cost somewhere around $4 to $5 trillion, and they're going to be looking for pay-fors. And they're going to be looking to the Inflation Reduction Act as the first place where they can implement cost savings to reauthorize that bill. There's also going to be the reauthorization of the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and see below a little bit about the different programs: highways, municipalities, airports, EV charging, and others.
And I would just add to that, we don't need to go through, I don't think, the rest of the slides necessarily, because we do want to give you all time for questions. But just know that on the Tax-mageddon question, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from the previous Trump administration will be the basis, whether or not Congress extends it, but also whether or not to repeal, modify, or extend tax provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act enacted by President Biden will also, be at issue. And so in these slides, we just, we sort of categorize that's the right slide. Some of those different tax credits that Congress will be considering in the larger context of Tax-mageddon.
Now, really quickly, there was a letter put out by 18 moderate House Republicans asking leadership not to take an axe to the Inflation Reduction Act and to be thoughtful about not just repealing the whole thing, and to kind of take a closer look program by program as to ways they could do some cost savings. Now, 14 of those members got reelected. They'll be back. And again, the margin of error in the House is way smaller than 14. So I don't think anyone believes that all of this is on the chopping block, but this is what's in the world of the possible. And, the most important thing at this point, as folks are looking for pay-fors, is to go in and be able to explain why these different programs are important.
Yep. And one of the reasons we believe that a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits and programs will be maintained is if you flip forward to the focus on political risk Republicans, that slide, you can see that Republican districts, that was as of June or July of this year, have received more investment from the Inflation Reduction Act than Democrat districts. Nate, if you go to the next slide, that shows you a map of, again, as of about June 16th, 2024, of Inflation Reduction Act investments in Republican districts versus, which are the red districts, versus in Democrat districts, which are the blue districts. So that gives you a visual for why there would be 18 Republicans that signed that letter, and perhaps others that haven't put their name on a letter but still would be resistant to interfering with those economic incentives that have helped drive economic opportunity in their districts.
Next slide, Nate.
Yeah, and I think in the remaining time, if you both would care to comment first on the topic of this slide, which is what is likely to happen in the remaining days of the lame duck session. And then because I know many of the membership are very interested in what's happening with the automobile, transportation sectors, talk a little bit about specifically to the extent you care to comment on what may happen to electric vehicle tax credit, what may happen to some of the funding for the EV supply chain.
Yeah.
Totally.
Do
So
you want me to say that first? Yeah.
totally.
On the EV question, it is a great question, and it is one that everyone at K&L Gates that's involved in these issues is tracking very closely. We don't know what the resolution is going to be in terms of the consumer purchase tax credit for purchasing electric vehicles, and in terms of what materials are allowed in those vehicles or not. To what extent are those materials connected to China or not? There are a lot of issues around that tax credit. In addition to, there's a lot of controversy around that tax credit. As a general matter, Republicans don't support that tax credit, but not every Republican objects to that tax credit. In addition, Elon Musk obviously is playing a prominent role in the Trump administration going forward. And to what extent, does he have thoughts on that tax credit, and how much impact does he have in terms of defending it? There are other programs that support electric vehicles. There's also the commercial vehicle tax credit. There's alternative fueling infrastructure tax credit. There are electric charging station programs at the Department of Transportation that are providing funding to states. All of these things will be reviewed by the Trump administration. Our final analysis is they are probably not subject to repeal per se, but perhaps modification, maybe further restriction around them, maybe reducing the scope of eligibility for them. And that's kind of a thumbnail sketch, very much a dynamic question going forward that we have lots of clients interested in. Scott.
So what's possible in the next 10 days? A lot on the screen. Right now, the House is actually considering the FY 2025 NDAA. For those of you that are tracking, and NDAA is the National Defense Reauthorization Act. It is passed bipartisanly more than over the last 50 years every year. So it's one of the few remaining bastions of bipartisanship. There was a lot of rumors going around that there would be a number of China trade provisions that were in consideration to be attached to that bill. Unfortunately, most of them did not make it. There was a provision related to a little bit of extra tech hub funding, around $500 million in tech hub funding that was included and is being voted on as we speak. The FY 2025 federal funding, we will know more about that over the weekend. The timing is unclear, but we know there needs to be something done before next Friday, or there will be a government shutdown. It seems that we are thinking that's going to go until sometime to mid to late March. The Farm Bill looking like a 1-year continuing resolution of the Farm Bill, but that consideration of that will start again in the new year. Debt ceiling technically expires on January 2nd. Folks are saying that that'll most likely be addressed in March when President Trump is in control, and we'll see. The Senate will be focusing every moment that they are not voting on these pieces of legislation. They will be focusing on judicial nominations until the end of the year. We're going to see a real sprint going into January where Senate incoming Majority Leader Thune has said he wants to do a budget reconciliation on permitting, energy, and other related issues in the first 30 days. That is an incredibly time-intensive process, and it's going to kick off on January 2nd.
Great. I think that's a great place to leave it as we are out of time. But, thank you both, Matt and Scott, for that comment and the commentary and insights overall. I mean, clearly, I think as everybody can gather, there's a lot to watch, and we haven't even gotten to some of the other issues, like who's going to be nominated for some of the deputy roles, which are going to be key, who's going to be potential judicial nominees, what's going to happen with the court's response to some of these policy changes, a whole host of other issues. So I say that by way of a plug for stay tuned for next year when we will be continuing with this series of webinars. Look forward to having Matt and Scott join me again, as well as others from the K&L Gates team. And certainly thank you all for your attendance today. Copies of the slides, as well as a recording of the webinar, will be made available through your registration link. And look forward to seeing you next time. Wish everybody a great new year ahead and holiday season. Thanks so much.